Question 1. Compliance review shows that the organization's security team has identified numerous vulnerabilities through the National Vulnerability Database, NVD, and has a comprehensive list of common vulnerabilities and exposures, CVE. However, the remediation efforts appear to be prioritized based on the CVSS severity score alone, with little consideration for the specific context of the organization's web applications or the exploitability of these CVEs in their environment. The team has not actively consulted the OWASP Top 10 to understand common web application attack vectors that might be relevant to their systems. What is the most effective and compliant approach to prioritize and address these identified vulnerabilities? Option A. Prioritize remediation efforts by focusing exclusively on the latest CVEs published in the last quarter, as these are likely to be the most actively exploited. Option B. Conduct a thorough review of the NVD to identify the most frequently reported vulnerabilities and prioritize their remediation, assuming that widespread vulnerabilities pose the greatest threat. Option C. Correlate identified CVEs with the organization's specific technology stack and business impact. Cross-reference with the OWASP Top 10 for relevant web application threats, and then prioritize remediation based on a comprehensive risk assessment that considers exploitability, impact, and the likelihood of occurrence. Option D. Focus solely on remediating all vulnerabilities with a CVSS severity score of 7, 0 or higher, as indicated by the NVD, as this is the most objective measure of risk. The correct answer is C. Correlate identified CVEs with the organization's specific technology stack and business impact. Cross-reference with the OWASP Top 10 for relevant web application threats, and then prioritize remediation based on a comprehensive risk assessment that considers exploitability, impact, and the likelihood of occurrence. Explanation. This scenario presents a common challenge in cybersecurity compliance, effectively leveraging vulnerability intelligence to inform risk management and remediation efforts. The professional challenge lies in translating raw vulnerability data into actionable security improvements that align with regulatory expectations and organizational risk appetite. Careful judgment is required to prioritize remediation based on the potential impact of identified vulnerabilities, rather than solely on their prevalence or severity scores. The correct approach represents best professional practice because it demonstrates a proactive and risk-based methodology. By correlating CVE data with the organization's specific environment and business impact, and then referencing established frameworks like the OWASP Top 10 for web application risks, the security team can prioritize vulnerabilities that pose the greatest threat. This aligns with general cybersecurity best practices and the spirit of regulations that mandate reasonable security measures to protect data and systems. While specific CEH exam regulations might not detail every nuance, the underlying principle of risk-based security is universally applicable and expected. An incorrect approach that solely relies on CVE severity scores without considering exploitability or business context fails to adequately assess risk. This can lead to misallocation of resources, addressing low-impact vulnerabilities while ignoring critical ones. Ethically, this could be seen as a failure to exercise due diligence in protecting the organization's assets. Another incorrect approach that focuses only on the NVD without cross-referencing with OWASP Top 10 for web applications overlooks specific, high-risk attack vectors relevant to the organization's web presence. This narrow focus can leave critical web application vulnerabilities unaddressed, potentially leading to breaches. This demonstrates a lack of comprehensive understanding of the threat landscape. A third incorrect approach that prioritizes vulnerabilities based on their frequency in the NVD without considering their relevance to the organization's specific technology stack or business operations is inefficient. While frequency can be an indicator, it doesn't guarantee a vulnerability is exploitable or impactful in a given environment. This approach lacks the analytical rigor required for effective risk management. The professional reasoning process should involve 1. Understanding the organization's assets and their criticality. 2. Identifying potential threats and vulnerabilities through sources like CVE and NVD. 3. Assessing the likelihood and impact of exploitation, considering factors like exploit availability, ease of exploitation, and business impact. 4. Prioritizing remediation efforts based on this risk assessment, using frameworks like OWASP Top 10 to guide web application security. 5. Documenting the process and decisions for audit and continuous improvement. Question 2. Examination of the data shows that a cybersecurity consultant, operating under the Certified Ethical Hacker, say certification, has been tasked with assessing the security posture of a client's internal network. The engagement letter outlines a broad objective of identifying network vulnerabilities, but does not explicitly detail the specific types of scanning techniques to be employed. The consultant has access to the network and has identified several subnets to investigate. Which of the following actions best demonstrates adherence to both ethical and regulatory best practices for this scenario? Option A. Execute a broad OS fingerprinting scan on all active hosts to identify their operating systems, as this information is crucial for understanding potential exploit vectors. Option B. Initiate a comprehensive UDP scan across all identified subnets to discover open ports and services, as this technique is less likely to be logged by network devices. Option C. Immediately perform a full TCP Connect scan on all discovered IP addresses to enumerate all open ports and running services, as this provides the most complete picture of the attack surface. Option D. Conduct a ping sweep to identify active hosts, followed by a SYN scan on those hosts to identify open ports, and then attempt banner grabbing to determine service versions, all after confirming the scope of authorized activities with the client. The correct answer is B. Initiate a comprehensive UDP scan across all identified subnets to discover open ports and services, as this technique is less likely to be logged by network devices. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge due to the inherent tension between the need for thorough network reconnaissance and the potential for unauthorized access or disruption. A certified ethical hacker, say, must navigate this by adhering strictly to the scope of engagement and legal authorizations. The CEH's actions must be justifiable under the established regulatory framework and ethical guidelines governing cybersecurity professionals within the specified jurisdiction. The correct approach represents best professional practice because it prioritizes obtaining explicit, written authorization before initiating any network scanning activities. This aligns with the fundamental ethical principle of consent and the legal requirement to avoid unauthorized access, which is a cornerstone of cybersecurity regulations. Specifically, within the context of a CEH exam, this implies operating strictly within the defined scope of work, which would have been agreed upon with the client and documented. This documented authorization serves as a legal and ethical shield, ensuring that all actions are permissible and do not constitute a violation of privacy or computer misuse laws. The CEH's responsibility is to identify vulnerabilities, not to exploit them beyond the agreed-upon testing parameters. An incorrect approach that involves performing aggressive, broad-spectrum scanning without prior authorization would constitute a significant regulatory and ethical failure. Such actions could be interpreted as unauthorized access or attempted access, violating laws like the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act, CFA, in the U.S., or similar legislation in other jurisdictions. Ethically, it breaches the trust placed in the professional and could lead to legal repercussions for both the individual and their organization. Another incorrect approach might be to only perform passive reconnaissance, such as banner grabbing, without also conducting active scans like SYN or Connect scans when the scope explicitly permits them. While passive scanning is less intrusive, it may not uncover all critical vulnerabilities that active scanning techniques are designed to identify. Failing to conduct necessary active scans, when authorized, would be a failure to meet the objectives of the engagement and could leave the client exposed to risks that could have been identified and mitigated. The professional decision-making process for similar situations should involve a rigorous adherence to the engagement contract and scope of work. Before any technical activity commences, the professional must confirm that all necessary permissions are in place and clearly understood. This includes understanding the boundaries of what can be tested, the types of tools and techniques that are permissible, and the reporting requirements. If there is any ambiguity, the professional must seek clarification from the client or authorizing party before proceeding. This methodical approach ensures that all actions are compliant, ethical, and effectively serve the client's security objectives. Question 3. Performance analysis shows a significant number of vulnerabilities identified across the organization's network infrastructure and applications. The security team is tasked with developing a remediation plan, Which of the following approaches best aligns with industry best practices and regulatory expectations for managing these identified vulnerabilities? Option A. Immediately patch all identified vulnerabilities, regardless of their severity or potential impact, to ensure the network is as secure as possible. Option B. Conduct a thorough risk assessment to prioritize vulnerabilities based on their likelihood of exploitation and potential impact on the CIA triad, and then develop a phased remediation plan. Option C. Implement new security controls for all identified vulnerabilities, even if existing controls are already in place, to provide layered security. Option D. Focus remediation efforts exclusively on vulnerabilities classified as critical or high severity, and defer any medium or low severity vulnerabilities to a later, unspecified date. The correct answer is A. Immediately patch all identified vulnerabilities, regardless of their severity or potential impact, to ensure the network is as secure as possible. Explanation. This scenario presents a common challenge in information security, balancing the need for robust risk assessment with the practical constraints of resource allocation and operational impact. The professional challenge lies in identifying the most effective and compliant method to address identified vulnerabilities without causing undue disruption or incurring unnecessary costs. Careful judgment is required to prioritize actions based on risk, regulatory mandates, and business objectives. The correct approach represents best professional practice because it directly aligns with established risk management frameworks and regulatory requirements. By focusing on a comprehensive risk assessment that considers the likelihood and impact of threats against the CIA triad, an organization can prioritize remediation efforts. This systematic approach ensures that resources are directed towards the most critical vulnerabilities, thereby maximizing the effectiveness of security investments. Furthermore, this aligns with the principles of due diligence expected under regulations like HIPAA for protected health information or PCI DSS for payment card data, which mandate a proactive and risk-based approach to security. It also supports the development of effective security policies and procedures by providing data-driven justification for their implementation and enforcement. An incorrect approach that solely focuses on patching all identified vulnerabilities without a risk-based prioritization is professionally unacceptable. This is because it can lead to significant resource drain, operational disruption, and potentially miss higher priority risks. From a regulatory perspective, this approach fails to demonstrate a reasoned and proportionate response to identified risks, which could be a compliance failure under frameworks that require risk-based security controls. Another incorrect approach that ignores vulnerabilities deemed low risk without proper documentation and justification is also professionally unacceptable. While not all vulnerabilities require immediate remediation, a complete disregard for any identified risk, even if initially assessed as low, can lead to a false sense of security. If a low-risk vulnerability is exploited and leads to a significant breach, the organization may face regulatory scrutiny for failing to adequately address all identified security weaknesses, potentially violating the spirit of compliance frameworks that emphasize a comprehensive security posture. The professional reasoning process for similar situations should involve a structured risk assessment methodology. This includes asset identification, threat modeling, vulnerability analysis, and impact assessment. The results of this assessment should then be used to inform a risk treatment plan, which may involve mitigation, transference, acceptance, or avoidance of risks. Decision-making should be guided by a clear understanding of the organization's risk appetite, regulatory obligations, and business objectives. Regular review and updates to the risk assessment are crucial to maintain an effective security posture. Question 4. Compliance review shows that during a recent penetration test, an ethical hacker was tasked with gathering intelligence on a target organization. The hacker employed a variety of methods to understand the target's digital footprint. Which of the following approaches represents the most ethically sound and legally compliant method for initial information gathering within the scope of a penetration test, adhering to the principles of ethical hacking? Option A. Analyzing publicly available WHOIS records for domain registration details, performing DNS enumeration using standard tools to map network infrastructure, and reviewing public social media profiles for employee information and organizational insights. Option B. Using social engineering tactics to trick employees into revealing sensitive company information through direct communication channels. Option C. Attempting to exploit website vulnerabilities to access internal documentation and employee contact lists that are not directly exposed on the public-facing website. Option D. Initiating unauthorized zone transfers from the target's DNS servers to obtain a complete list of internal host names and IP addresses. Correct answer is A. Analyzing publicly available WHOIS records for domain registration details, performing DNS enumeration using standard tools to map network infrastructure, and reviewing public social media profiles for employee information and organizational insights. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires an ethical hacker to balance the need for comprehensive information gathering during a penetration test with the legal and ethical boundaries of accessing and utilizing publicly available information. The core difficulty lies in distinguishing between legitimate OSINT techniques and those that could be construed as unauthorized access or privacy violation, even if the data is technically public. The CEH certification emphasizes a strong ethical foundation, meaning that even if information is discoverable, the asterisk method asterisk of discovery and its asterisk purpose asterisk must align with ethical hacking principles and relevant regulations. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach involves utilizing publicly accessible information through legitimate OSINT tools and techniques that do not require bypassing security controls or exploiting vulnerabilities. This aligns with the CEH's ethical framework, which mandates that penetration testers operate within the scope of engagement and respect privacy. Specifically, using WHOIS lookups to understand domain registration, DNS enumeration to map network infrastructure, and analyzing publicly available website and social media profiles are standard, ethical footprinting methods. These techniques gather information that is intentionally or unintentionally exposed to the public internet, providing valuable insights without crossing legal or ethical lines. The CEH's emphasis on responsible disclosure and ethical conduct is upheld by this approach. Incorrect approaches analysis. An approach that involves attempting to bypass website security measures to access internal documentation or user lists, even if that information is later deemed publicly relevant to the target's operations, represents a significant ethical and regulatory failure. This constitutes unauthorized access, which is illegal and a direct violation of ethical hacking principles. It moves beyond passive information gathering into active intrusion. Another incorrect approach would be to engage in social engineering tactics that deceive individuals into revealing sensitive information that is not publicly available. While social media footprinting can involve analyzing public profiles, it should not extend to manipulative communication designed to extract non-public data. This violates privacy and can have legal ramifications depending on the jurisdiction and the nature of the information obtained. Finally, an approach that involves exploiting misconfigured DNS records to gain unauthorized access to internal network details or sensitive zone transfer information would be a clear violation. While DNS enumeration is a valid technique, it must be performed in a way that respects the security posture of the target and does not involve active exploitation of vulnerabilities. Professional reasoning. Professionals in this field must adopt a permission-first, information-second mindset. Before any information gathering, ensure a clear, written scope of engagement is established and adhered to. When employing OSINT techniques, always ask, is this information intentionally made public, or am I actively seeking to circumvent security to obtain it? Prioritize passive reconnaissance methods that rely on readily available public data. If a technique feels borderline or could be misinterpreted as intrusive, it is best to avoid it or seek explicit clarification from the client. Understanding the legal and ethical implications of each tool and technique is paramount, aligning with the CEH's commitment to responsible cybersecurity practices. Question 5. Analysis of a scenario where an ethical hacker has identified several potential avenues for privilege escalation on a target Windows server. These include a weak service permission, an outdated application with a known remote code execution vulnerability, and a user account with overly broad local administrative rights. The ethical hacker needs to determine the most appropriate next step to assess and demonstrate the risk associated with these findings, adhering strictly to the certified ethical hacker, say, examination's regulatory framework and ethical guidelines. Option A. Attempt to leverage the user account with overly broad local administrative rights to gain further access, as this is a direct indication of a misconfiguration that needs immediate exploitation. Option B. Focus solely on the weak service permission, as it represents a low-hanging fruit that can be exploited with minimal effort. Option C. Conduct a risk assessment to prioritize the identified vulnerabilities based on their potential impact and likelihood of exploitation, focusing on the least intrusive methods first to demonstrate risk without causing system instability. Option D. Immediately attempt to exploit the outdated application's remote code execution vulnerability to gain administrative access, as this is a direct path to privilege escalation. The correct answer is C. Conduct a risk assessment to prioritize the identified vulnerabilities based on their potential impact and likelihood of exploitation, focusing on the least intrusive methods first to demonstrate risk without causing system instability. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a common challenge in ethical hacking, identifying and exploiting privilege escalation vulnerabilities within a target system. The professional challenge lies in accurately assessing the risk posed by identified weaknesses without causing unintended damage or violating legal boundaries. Ethical hackers must balance the need to demonstrate exploitability with the imperative to operate within the scope of their engagement and adhere to strict ethical and legal guidelines. Complexity arises from the need to understand the nuances of operating system security, common misconfigurations, and the potential impact of successful exploitation on system integrity and data confidentiality. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach involves a systematic risk assessment that prioritizes vulnerabilities based on their potential impact and likelihood of exploitation, considering the specific operating system and its known weaknesses. This aligns with the CEH's emphasis on ethical and legal conduct. By focusing on documented vulnerabilities and misconfigurations, the ethical hacker demonstrates a methodical and responsible approach. This methodology ensures that the assessment is not only technically sound, but also ethically justifiable, as it aims to identify and report potential security gaps in a controlled manner. The CEH framework mandates that all actions must be within the agreed-upon scope and adhere to relevant laws and ethical codes, which this approach directly supports by focusing on a structured, risk-based methodology. Incorrect approaches analysis. One incorrect approach involves immediately attempting to exploit any identified weakness without prior risk assessment. This is ethically and legally problematic because it bypasses crucial steps in responsible vulnerability management. It could lead to unintended system disruption, data loss, or even legal repercussions if the exploitation goes beyond the agreed-upon scope or causes damage. This directly violates the CEH principle of minimizing harm and operating within defined boundaries. Another incorrect approach is to solely rely on automated tools without manual verification and analysis. While automated tools are valuable for initial discovery, they can produce false positives or miss subtle, context-dependent vulnerabilities. An ethical hacker's responsibility extends to understanding the underlying mechanisms of an exploit and its potential consequences. Over-reliance on automation without critical human oversight can lead to inaccurate risk assessments and potentially harmful actions, failing to meet the professional standard of thoroughness and due diligence expected of a CEH. A third incorrect approach is to ignore potential misconfigurations and focus only on known software exploits. Misconfigurations are a significant source of privilege escalation vulnerabilities and are often easier to exploit than complex software flaws. Neglecting them represents a failure to conduct a comprehensive assessment, thereby providing an incomplete picture of the system's security posture. This oversight can leave critical vulnerabilities unaddressed, failing the ethical hacker's duty to provide a complete and accurate security evaluation. Professional reasoning. Professionals should adopt a phased approach to privilege escalation assessment. This begins with reconnaissance and enumeration to understand the system and identify potential attack vectors. Subsequently, a risk-based analysis should be performed, categorizing vulnerabilities by severity, exploitability, and potential impact. Exploitation attempts should only be made after careful consideration of the risks and with explicit authorization, always prioritizing non-destructive methods where possible. Documentation and reporting are paramount, clearly outlining findings, risks, and remediation recommendations. This structured decision-making process ensures that ethical hacking activities are effective, responsible, and legally compliant, aligning with the core tenets of the CEH certification. Question 6. Strategic planning requires an ethical hacker to select the most appropriate port scanning technique for initial network reconnaissance during a penetration test. The objective is to identify open ports and running services on a target network segment without triggering immediate alerts from intrusion detection systems or leaving a significant forensic footprint. Considering the need for stealth and the potential for detection, which of the following approaches best aligns with ethical hacking principles and regulatory guidelines for authorized reconnaissance? Option A, an idle scan, which leverages a vulnerable zombie host to send packets to the target, observing the zombie's IP ID increments. Option B, a SYN scan, also known as a half-open scan, which sends a SYN packet and analyzes the response, SYN/ACK or RSD, without completing the TCP handshake. Option C, an XMS scan, which sets the FIN, PSH, and URG flags in the TCP header, sending a single packet to each port. Option D, a full TCP connect scan, which establishes a complete three-way handshake with each port to determine its status. The correct answer is B, a SYN scan, also known as a half-open scan, which sends a SYN packet and analyzes the response, SYN/ACK or RSD, without completing the TCP handshake. Explanation: this scenario presents a common challenge in ethical hacking, balancing the need for comprehensive reconnaissance with the imperative to remain undetected and compliant with legal and ethical boundaries. Professional challenge lies in selecting port scanning techniques that provide sufficient information about network services without triggering intrusion detection systems or violating the principle of authorized access. Careful judgment is required to avoid actions that could be misconstrued as malicious or that exceed the scope of the engagement. The correct approach represents best professional practice because it prioritizes stealth and minimizes the risk of detection, which is crucial for maintaining the integrity of the engagement and adhering to the principles of ethical hacking. Specifically, employing techniques like SYN scans, half-open scans, or FIN scans, when appropriate and authorized, allows for the identification of open ports without completing a full TCP connection. This reduces the noise generated on the target system's logs, making it less likely to alert administrators. Furthermore, understanding the nuances of these scans, such as how they are handled by different operating systems and firewalls, is key to effective and ethical reconnaissance. The CEH framework emphasizes performing authorized scans and understanding the implications of each technique. Incorrect approaches, such as a full TCP connect scan without proper authorization or context, represent regulatory and ethical failures. A TCP connect scan completes a full three-way handshake, which is easily logged by target systems and can be interpreted as an attempted intrusion. This violates the principle of authorized access and could lead to legal repercussions or the termination of the engagement. Similarly, employing techniques like XMS or null scans without a thorough understanding of their effectiveness against the target environment and their potential to be flagged as suspicious activity is ethically questionable. These scans, while designed to be stealthy, can sometimes be interpreted as probing for vulnerabilities or attempting to bypass security controls, especially if they generate unusual network traffic patterns. The idle scan, while stealthy, relies on specific conditions of the target's network and the availability of an idle host, and its misuse could still lead to unintended consequences or detection if not executed with precision and within the authorized scope. The professional decision-making process for similar situations should involve a thorough understanding of the engagement scope and authorization. For selecting any port scanning technique, an ethical hacker must 1. Confirm explicit authorization for the type and depth of scanning. 2. Research the target environment's known security posture and logging mechanisms. 3. Select the least intrusive method that yields the required information. 4. Be prepared to adapt the scanning strategy based on initial findings or potential detection. 5. Document all actions and their justifications meticulously. This systematic approach ensures that reconnaissance activities are both effective and ethically sound, aligning with the CEH's commitment to responsible security practices. Question 7. Cost-benefit analysis shows that implementing a comprehensive security hardening strategy for Windows, Linux, and Mac OS environments is a priority, but the organization has limited resources. Which of the following approaches best balances security, operational efficiency, and regulatory compliance for user account management, file system security, process monitoring, and system logging. Option A. Disable all non-essential services across all operating systems to minimize the attack surface, without a detailed service dependency analysis. Option B. Implement the principle of least privilege for all user accounts. Enforce granular file system permissions based on job roles. Establish robust process monitoring with real-time alerting for suspicious activities. And configure centralized, immutable system logging with regular review and retention policies. Option C. Focus solely on implementing extensive file system encryption for all data, assuming that encryption alone will mitigate most security risks. Option D. Grant all users administrative privileges to simplify troubleshooting and software installation, and rely on endpoint detection and response EDR solutions for security monitoring. The correct answer is B. Implement the principle of least privilege for all user accounts. Enforce granular file system permissions based on job roles. Establish robust process monitoring with real-time alerting for suspicious activities. And configure centralized, immutable system logging with regular review and retention policies. Explanation. This scenario presents a common challenge in cybersecurity, balancing robust security measures with operational efficiency and user experience, all while adhering to stringent regulatory requirements. The professional challenge lies in identifying the most effective and compliant approach to hardening operating systems and managing user access without introducing undue risk or hindering legitimate business operations. Careful judgment is required to select methods that are both technically sound and legally defensible. The correct approach represents best professional practice because it prioritizes a layered security strategy that addresses multiple facets of operating system security. Implementing least privilege principles for user accounts, enforcing strong file system permissions, and establishing comprehensive process monitoring and auditing are foundational to a secure environment. These practices directly align with common regulatory frameworks that mandate data protection, access control, and accountability. For example, in a U.S. context, regulations like HIPAA for healthcare data or PCI DSS for payment card data implicitly or explicitly require such controls to prevent unauthorized access and maintain data integrity. Similarly, GDPR in Europe emphasizes data minimization and access controls. Ethical hacking principles also dictate a proactive and defense-in-depth approach, which this option embodies. An incorrect approach that focuses solely on disabling all non-essential services without a thorough risk assessment is professionally unacceptable. This can lead to operational disruptions, impacting business continuity and potentially violating service-level agreements. From a regulatory standpoint, while disabling services can enhance security, an indiscriminate approach might inadvertently disable critical functions required for compliance with specific industry regulations, leading to non-compliance. Another incorrect approach that relies solely on centralized logging without proper analysis and response mechanisms is also flawed. While logging is crucial for auditing and incident investigation, unmonitored logs are effectively useless. This can lead to missed security incidents, which could result in regulatory penalties for failing to detect and respond to breaches in a timely manner. Ethically, failing to act on available security information is a dereliction of duty. An incorrect approach that involves granting administrative privileges to all users to simplify troubleshooting is a severe security and regulatory failure. This directly violates the principle of least privilege, significantly increasing the attack surface and the potential for privilege escalation. Many regulations explicitly mandate granular access controls and the restriction of administrative rights to authorized personnel only. Such a practice would make it impossible to demonstrate compliance with access control requirements and would be a primary target for auditors and forensic investigators in the event of a breach. The professional decision-making process for similar situations should involve a thorough understanding of the organization's specific threat landscape, business objectives, and applicable regulatory requirements. This includes conducting regular risk assessments, implementing security controls based on established frameworks like NIST or CIS benchmarks, and continuously monitoring and auditing the effectiveness of those controls. Professionals must also stay abreast of evolving threats and regulatory changes to ensure ongoing compliance and security posture. Question 8. Research into a target organization's web presence has revealed several publicly accessible files and directories The ethical hacker needs to understand the underlying technologies and structure of the website to identify potential attack vectors. Which of the following approaches best aligns with the principles of responsible and effective website footprinting for an ethical hacking engagement, focusing on impact assessment? Option A. Attempt to brute force administrative login pages using common username and password combinations. Option B. Analyze the robots, TXT file and sitemap, XML to understand the site structure and discover hidden or disallowed paths, and examine HTTP headers and source code for technology clues. Option C. Initiate a series of SQL injection attempts against all identified input fields to test for database vulnerabilities. Option D. Download the entire website content using an automated tool to perform offline analysis of all files. The correct answer is B. Analyze the robots, TXT file and sitemap, XML to understand the site structure and discover hidden or disallowed paths, and examine HTTP headers and source code for technology clues. Explanation. This scenario presents a common challenge in ethical hacking, gathering intelligence about a target's web infrastructure without triggering immediate defensive measures or violating ethical boundaries. The professional challenge lies in balancing the need for comprehensive information gathering with the imperative to remain undetected and within the scope of authorized engagement. Careful judgment is required to select methods that are both effective and compliant with ethical hacking principles and any stipulated legal frameworks. The correct approach represents best professional practice because it prioritizes non-intrusive, publicly available information. Analyzing the website structure, identifying technologies through passive observation, e.g., HTTP headers, source code comments, and examining robots, TXT and sitemaps are all standard low-risk footprinting techniques. These methods adhere to the principle of least privilege and minimize the digital footprint of the assessment, thereby reducing the likelihood of detection by security systems. Ethically, this aligns with the CEH's emphasis on responsible information gathering and respecting the target's digital environment. Legally, these techniques generally fall within the bounds of authorized reconnaissance when conducted under a formal agreement. An incorrect approach that involves actively probing for vulnerabilities or attempting to exploit known weaknesses in identified technologies during the initial footprinting phase is professionally unacceptable. This constitutes an intrusive action that goes beyond passive reconnaissance and could be interpreted as a breach of the engagement scope, potentially leading to legal repercussions or termination of the contract. Such actions violate the ethical obligation to operate within agreed-upon parameters and could be construed as unauthorized access or malicious activity. Another incorrect approach, such as attempting to brute force login credentials for administrative interfaces identified during footprinting, is also a significant ethical and professional failure. This is an aggressive, intrusive technique that directly attempts to gain unauthorized access. It crosses the line from information gathering to attempted exploitation, which is typically outside the scope of initial footprinting and requires explicit authorization. This action could lead to account lockouts, system instability, and severe legal consequences, including charges of unauthorized access. A further incorrect approach might involve downloading the entire website content without explicit permission. While seemingly less intrusive than active probing, mass downloading can consume significant server resources, potentially impacting the website's performance and availability. This can be considered a denial of service, do-s vector, even if unintentional, and violates the principle of minimizing impact on the target system. It also goes beyond passive information gathering and can be seen as an unauthorized data exfiltration attempt. The professional decision-making process for similar situations should involve a clear understanding of the engagement scope of work and authorization. Before commencing any activity, ethical hackers must review the rules of engagement row to define permissible actions. The process should prioritize passive reconnaissance techniques that gather information without altering the target system or its services. If active techniques are required, they must be explicitly authorized and scheduled. Continuous monitoring of the target's response and potential detection is also crucial, allowing for adjustments to the methodology if necessary to maintain stealth and compliance. Question 9. The efficiency study reveals that a newly discovered malware variant exhibits sophisticated propagation techniques and a novel detection evasion mechanism. As a certified ethical hacker, say, tasked with its analysis, What is the most responsible and ethically sound course of action to ensure comprehensive understanding and mitigate future risks, while strictly adhering to the CEH's professional code of conduct and relevant cybersecurity regulations? Option A. Attempt to directly neutralize the malware by modifying its code on the affected production server to prevent further spread, without a full analysis of its potential side effects. Option B. Immediately share the malware's propagation details with a trusted external cybersecurity researcher to expedite the development of a universal patch. Bypassing internal reporting protocols. Option C. Erase all traces of the malware from the infected systems as quickly as possible to minimize immediate damage, without performing a deep analysis of its characteristics. Option D. Conduct a detailed static and dynamic analysis of the malware in a secure, isolated lab environment, meticulously documenting its structure, propagation methods, and evasion techniques, and then report findings through authorized channels for remediation planning. The correct answer is D. Conduct a detailed static and dynamic analysis of the malware in a secure, isolated lab environment, meticulously documenting its structure, propagation methods, and evasion techniques, and then report findings through authorized channels for remediation planning. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents an ethical dilemma for a certified ethical hacker, say, tasked with analyzing a virus. The challenge lies in balancing the need for thorough analysis to understand the virus's structure, propagation, and detection mechanisms, with the potential for accidental or intentional misuse of the discovered information. The CEH must navigate the ethical imperative to protect systems and data, while also adhering to legal and regulatory frameworks that govern the handling of potentially malicious code. The pressure to provide a comprehensive report quickly, coupled with the sensitive nature of the findings, amplifies the need for careful judgment and adherence to established protocols. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach involves a meticulous, controlled analysis within an isolated environment, documenting all findings and reporting them through secure, authorized channels. This aligns with the CEH's ethical obligations to act with integrity and competence. Specifically, it adheres to the principles of responsible disclosure and the CEH's role in identifying vulnerabilities and threats without causing harm. The focus on understanding propagation and detection mechanisms is crucial for developing effective countermeasures, which is a core tenet of ethical hacking. The regulatory framework for ethical hacking, particularly concerning the handling of malware, emphasizes containment, analysis, and reporting to prevent further spread or exploitation. Incorrect approach is analysis. One incorrect approach involves immediately sharing the virus's propagation methods with a third-party security researcher without proper authorization or vetting. This violates the principle of responsible disclosure and could inadvertently lead to the exploitation of the vulnerability by malicious actors before defenses can be implemented. It bypasses established incident response protocols and could have legal ramifications if the unauthorized disclosure leads to a breach. Another incorrect approach is to attempt to neutralize the virus by directly modifying its code in a live environment. This is highly risky and could lead to system instability, data corruption, or even the accidental activation of dormant malicious payloads. It demonstrates a lack of understanding of safe malware analysis practices and could result in significant damage, potentially violating laws related to unauthorized modification of computer systems. A third incorrect approach is to delete the virus and its associated files without a thorough analysis of its structure and propagation vectors. While seemingly a quick fix, this prevents the organization from understanding the threat, developing appropriate defenses, and potentially identifying the source of the infection. This failure to conduct a complete analysis hinders the organization's long-term security posture and could be seen as a dereliction of professional duty, especially if the virus has broader implications. Professional reasoning. Professionals in this situation should follow a structured incident response and malware analysis methodology. This typically involves 1. Containment, isolate the infected system. 2. Analysis, perform static and dynamic analysis in a secure, isolated lab environment. 3. Documentation, meticulously record all observations regarding the virus's structure, behavior, propagation, and detection. 4. Reporting, communicate findings through official, secure channels to relevant stakeholders and, if applicable, to regulatory bodies or CERT, following responsible disclosure guidelines. 5. Remediation, Based on the analysis, develop and implement effective removal and prevention strategies. This systematic approach ensures that the analysis is thorough, safe, and contributes to overall security without creating new risks. Question 10. Operational review demonstrates that a web application handling sensitive customer information requires secure communication channels for data transmission between the client and the server. The development team is considering several cryptographic approaches to implement this security. Which of the following approaches best aligns with industry, best practices, and regulatory expectations for protecting data in transit? Option A. Develop and implement a proprietary, custom-built encryption algorithm that has not undergone public scrutiny or formal cryptographic analysis. Option B. Utilize a symmetric encryption algorithm like AES to encrypt the data, with keys exchanged manually via a separate, unsecured channel. Option C. Employ a hashing algorithm like SHA-256 to ensure data integrity during transmission, without providing confidentiality. Option D. Implement transport layer security, TLS, with strong, modern cipher suites to establish an encrypted and authenticated communication channel. The correct answer is D. Implement transport layer security, TLS, with strong, modern cipher suites to establish an encrypted and authenticated communication channel. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge due to the critical need to balance security requirements with operational efficiency and compliance within the defined regulatory framework for the Certified Ethical Hacker (CEH) exam. The core of the challenge lies in selecting the most appropriate cryptographic approach for protecting sensitive data in transit, considering the inherent trade-offs between security strength, performance, and implementation complexity, all while adhering to the specific, albeit unstated but implied by the exam context, U.S. regulatory landscape governing data protection and cybersecurity. The correct approach represents best professional practice because it prioritizes a robust, industry-standard cryptographic protocol that has undergone extensive peer review and is widely accepted for securing network communications. This aligns with the general principles of due diligence and reasonable security measures expected under U.S. cybersecurity regulations, which often mandate the protection of sensitive data. Utilizing a well-established protocol like TLS with strong cipher suites ensures confidentiality, integrity, and authentication, thereby mitigating risks of eavesdropping, tampering, and impersonation. This proactive stance in selecting a proven solution demonstrates a commitment to security best practices and helps avoid potential regulatory penalties associated with data breaches. An incorrect approach that relies solely on symmetric encryption without a secure key exchange mechanism is professionally unacceptable. This failure stems from a fundamental misunderstanding of secure communication. Symmetric encryption is fast but requires a secure method to distribute keys. Without a robust key management strategy, the entire communication channel becomes vulnerable. This could lead to a violation of regulations like HIPAA if health data is involved, or PCI DSS if payment card data is involved, which mandate specific security controls for data in transit. Another incorrect approach that proposes using only hashing for data in transit is also professionally unacceptable. Hashing algorithms are designed for data integrity verification, not for confidentiality. While they can detect if data has been altered, they do not prevent unauthorized parties from reading the data. This would be a clear violation of data protection principles and likely contravene regulations requiring confidentiality of sensitive information. Finally, an approach that suggests implementing a custom, unproven cryptographic algorithm is highly risky and professionally unsound. The development and rigorous testing of cryptographic algorithms require specialized expertise and significant time. Custom algorithms are prone to subtle flaws that can be exploited by attackers, leading to catastrophic security failures. This lack of adherence to established, vetted cryptographic standards would be a significant ethical and regulatory failing, demonstrating negligence in protecting sensitive data. The professional decision-making process for similar situations should involve a thorough risk assessment. This includes identifying the sensitivity of the data, the threat landscape, the performance requirements, and the applicable regulatory obligations. The next step is to evaluate available cryptographic solutions against these criteria, prioritizing well-vetted, industry-standard protocols and algorithms. Documentation of the decision-making process, including the rationale for selecting a particular solution and the identified risks, is crucial for demonstrating due diligence and compliance. Question 11. Which approach would be most appropriate for an ethical hacker to gather information about user accounts, group memberships, and network shares on a target Windows network, while minimizing the risk of detection and adhering to the principles of authorized penetration testing? Option A. Sending large volumes of ICMP echo requests to all discovered IP addresses to map the network, and then attempting to query all systems for sensitive registry keys related to user accounts. Option B. Using aggressive Nmap scripts to identify all running services, and then attempting to exploit known vulnerabilities in those services to gain access to user information and shares. Option C. Directly attempting to brute force common user credentials against the domain controller and attempting to access all discovered network shares without prior authorization. Option D. Attempting to enumerate users and groups via NetBIOS or SMB enumeration, and identifying accessible shares by querying common ports and service banners. The correct answer is D. Attempting to enumerate users and groups via NetBIOS or SMB enumeration, and identifying accessible shares by querying common ports and service banners. Explanation. This scenario presents a common challenge in ethical hacking, gathering intelligence about a target network without triggering alarms or violating legal boundaries. The professional challenge lies in balancing the need for comprehensive enumeration with the imperative to operate within the scope of authorized penetration testing and adhere to relevant legal and ethical guidelines. Careful judgment is required to select techniques that are effective yet minimally intrusive, ensuring that the engagement remains within its defined parameters and avoids potential legal repercussions. The correct approach represents best professional practice because it prioritizes methods that are less likely to be detected by intrusion detection systems, IDs, or security monitoring tools, and it focuses on publicly available or less sensitive information. For instance, DNS enumeration using publicly accessible DNS servers or zone transfers, if permitted, is a standard, low-impact method for discovering hostnames and IP addresses. Similarly, enumerating SMB shares on systems that are intentionally exposed or accessible within the defined scope, or using SNMP with default or provided credentials, are established techniques. The ethical and legal justification stems from operating within the agreed-upon scope of the penetration test, respecting the target's security posture, and avoiding actions that could be construed as unauthorized access or disruption. This aligns with the principles of responsible disclosure and ethical hacking, where the goal is to identify vulnerabilities, not to cause harm or gain unauthorized access. Incorrect approaches are professionally unacceptable due to their higher risk of detection, potential for unauthorized access, and violation of ethical and legal boundaries. For example, attempting to brute force user accounts on a system without explicit permission is a direct violation of unauthorized access policies and could lead to legal consequences. Similarly, aggressively probing for open NFS shares without prior authorization, especially if these shares contain sensitive data, crosses the line from enumeration to potential data exfiltration or unauthorized access. Exploiting default SNMP community strings on critical infrastructure without a clear understanding of the target's security policies and without explicit authorization can lead to misconfigurations or denial of service conditions, which are outside the scope of ethical enumeration. These actions demonstrate a lack of due diligence and a disregard for the target's security and legal framework, undermining the trust placed in the ethical hacker. The professional reasoning process for similar situations involves a systematic approach. 1. Understand the scope. Thoroughly review and confirm the authorized scope of the penetration test, including specific systems, networks, and permitted techniques. 2. Risk assessment. Evaluate the potential impact and detectability of each enumeration technique. Prioritize methods with lower risk profiles. 3. Legal and ethical compliance. Ensure all chosen techniques are legal and align with ethical hacking principles and any specific contractual obligations or regulatory frameworks, e.g., GDPR, HIPAA, if applicable to the target. 4. Documentation. Meticulously document all actions taken, including the techniques used, the information gathered, and the timestamps. This is crucial for reporting and for demonstrating compliance. 5. Communication. Maintain open communication with the client or authorizing party, especially if any unexpected findings or potential risks are encountered. Question 12. The review process indicates that the organization has identified a significant number of vulnerabilities across its network infrastructure and applications. Simultaneously, threat intelligence feeds are reporting an increase in phishing campaigns targeting the financial services sector, and the emergence of a new ransomware variant actively exploiting a specific, unpatched web server vulnerability. Considering the certified ethical hacker, say, exams focus on threat landscape analysis and vulnerability management. Which of the following approaches best aligns with professional best practices and regulatory expectations for prioritizing remediation efforts? Option A. Focus remediation efforts on the most technically sophisticated threats, such as zero-day exploits and advanced persistent threats, APT, as these represent the highest potential impact. Option B. Allocate resources to address only those vulnerabilities that have been publicly disclosed and have a corresponding CVE, common vulnerabilities and exposures, identifier. Option C. Prioritize patching and mitigation based on a risk assessment that correlates identified vulnerabilities with the likelihood of exploitation by active threat actors and the potential business impact. Option D. Immediately patch all identified vulnerabilities, regardless of their severity or exploitability, to eliminate the attack surface comprehensively. The correct answer is D. Immediately patch all identified vulnerabilities, regardless of their severity or exploitability, to eliminate the attack surface comprehensively. Explanation: scenario analysis. This scenario presents a common challenge in cybersecurity, balancing proactive threat intelligence with reactive incident response. The professional challenge lies in accurately prioritizing limited resources to address the most imminent and impactful threats. A failure to do so can lead to significant security breaches, financial losses, and reputational damage, all of which have regulatory implications. The CEH certification emphasizes understanding the threat landscape and applying that knowledge to protect an organization, making this a core competency. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach involves a systematic analysis of the threat landscape, focusing on the specific vulnerabilities identified within the organization's attack surface. This aligns with best practices in vulnerability management and threat intelligence. By correlating known vulnerabilities with active threat actor campaigns and the potential impact of successful exploitation, an organization can make informed decisions about remediation priorities. This proactive stance is crucial for meeting regulatory expectations for due diligence in cybersecurity. For example, in the U.S., frameworks like NIST Cybersecurity Framework and regulations like HIPAA for healthcare or PCI DSS for payment card data implicitly or explicitly require organizations to understand their risks and prioritize mitigation efforts based on threat intelligence and vulnerability assessments. This approach demonstrates a commitment to a risk-based security posture, which is a cornerstone of modern cybersecurity compliance. Incorrect approach is analysis, focusing solely on the volume of reported vulnerabilities without considering their exploitability or the active threat landscape, is a significant regulatory and ethical failure. This approach can lead to misallocation of resources, addressing low-risk issues while ignoring critical threats. It fails to demonstrate due diligence in understanding the organization's specific risk profile, prioritizing only the most technically complex threats, such as sophisticated APTs, without assessing their immediate relevance or impact on the organization's specific assets, is another failure. While APTs are a serious concern, an organization might be more immediately at risk from a widespread phishing campaign targeting its employees or a known exploit for a critical, unpatched vulnerability. This approach neglects the principle of addressing the most probable and impactful threats first, which is a fundamental aspect of risk management and regulatory compliance. Responding only to publicly disclosed vulnerabilities without proactive scanning and threat intelligence integration is reactive and insufficient. Regulations often expect organizations to have robust vulnerability management programs that include discovery, assessment, and remediation, not just a reaction to public disclosures. This approach leaves the organization exposed to zero-day exploits or threats that have not yet been widely publicized, representing a failure to implement a comprehensive security program. Professional reasoning. Professionals should adopt a risk-based approach to threat management. This involves 1. Understanding the organization's assets and their criticality. 2. Continuously monitoring the threat landscape for relevant threats and threat actors. 3. Regularly assessing the organization's attack surface for vulnerabilities. 4. Correlating identified vulnerabilities with active threats and potential impact. 5. Prioritizing remediation efforts based on this risk assessment, focusing on the most likely and impactful threats. 6. Documenting the entire process to demonstrate due diligence and compliance. Question 13. The analysis reveals that during a contracted penetration test of a client's network, an ethical hacker discovers a misconfigured server containing highly sensitive personal identifiable information, PI, of the client's customers, which was not part of the original scope of the engagement. The ethical hacker has not yet accessed or exfiltrated any of this PII, but the discovery presents a significant security risk. What is the most ethical and professionally responsible course of action? Option A. Directly contact the individuals whose PII was discovered to warn them of the potential breach. Option B. Continue exploring the sensitive data to fully understand the extent of the misconfiguration and potential impact, with the intention of providing a more comprehensive report. Option C. Ignore the discovery and continue with the original penetration test plan, as the sensitive data was outside the agreed-upon scope. Option D. Immediately cease all further exploration of the unauthorized data, document the discovery, and report it through the established incident response channels to the client. The correct answer is D. Immediately cease all further exploration of the unauthorized data, document the discovery, and report it through the established incident response channels to the client. Explanation. This scenario presents a common ethical dilemma faced by ethical hackers, balancing the discovery of vulnerabilities with the potential for unintended consequences and legal ramifications. The professional challenge lies in navigating the gray areas of authorized access and responsible disclosure, especially when dealing with sensitive information that could be exploited by malicious actors. Careful judgment is required to ensure that actions remain within the scope of the engagement and adhere to ethical principles and legal boundaries. The correct approach involves immediately ceasing further exploration of the unauthorized data and reporting the discovery through the established incident response channels. This represents best professional practice because it prioritizes containment and responsible disclosure. By stopping further access, the ethical hacker prevents potential data exfiltration or modification, thereby minimizing harm. Reporting through official channels ensures that the organization is alerted to the security lapse and can take appropriate action. This aligns with ethical hacking principles that emphasize minimizing damage and acting in the best interest of the client, as well as adhering to the spirit of the engagement scope. An incorrect approach of continuing to explore the sensitive data, even with good intentions of understanding the full scope of the breach, constitutes a significant ethical and regulatory failure. This action exceeds the authorized scope of the penetration test and could be construed as unauthorized access or data misuse, potentially violating laws like the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act, CFA, in the U.S. It also breaches the trust placed in the ethical hacker by the client. Another incorrect approach, that of ignoring the discovery and proceeding with the original penetration test plan, is also professionally unacceptable. This failure to report a critical security finding is a dereliction of duty. It leaves the organization vulnerable to exploitation by malicious actors, directly contradicting the purpose of ethical hacking, which is to identify and help remediate security weaknesses. Ethically, it is a breach of professional responsibility to the client. Finally, an incorrect approach of directly contacting the individuals whose data was accessed without authorization from the client is also problematic. While seemingly helpful, this bypasses the organization's established security and legal protocols. It could lead to panic, legal complications for the organization, and potentially compromise the ongoing investigation or remediation efforts. It also violates the principle of working through authorized channels and respecting the client's control over their data and communication. The professional reasoning process for similar situations should involve 1. Immediately assessing the nature and sensitivity of the discovered information. 2. Ceasing any actions that go beyond the initial discovery and could be construed as unauthorized access or data manipulation. 3. Consulting the engagement contract and established incident response procedures. 4. Reporting the finding through the designated channels to the appropriate stakeholders within the client organization. 5. Documenting all actions and findings meticulously. 6. seeking guidance from legal counsel or senior management if the situation is complex or ambiguous. Question 14. Quality control measures reveal that a critical server has been compromised, with evidence suggesting an attacker may have attempted to cover their tracks by manipulating system logs and potentially installing a rootkit. As the lead ethical hacker tasked with incident response, what is the most appropriate course of action to ensure a thorough and compliant investigation? Option A. Focus solely on identifying and removing the rootkit to regain system control, assuming that log manipulation is too advanced to be reliably investigated. Option B. Immediately isolate the affected server, create a forensic image of its storage, and then proceed with log analysis and rootkit detection/removal on the isolated system, meticulously documenting every step. Option C. Prioritize the immediate restoration of the server to its last known good configuration from backups to minimize business disruption, and then conduct a superficial review of available logs. Option D. Initiate a system-wide search for the attacker's presence and begin deleting suspicious log entries to prevent further evidence contamination. Then focus on removing any identified rootkits. Correct answer is B. Immediately isolate the affected server, create a forensic image of its storage, and then proceed with log analysis and rootkit detection/removal on the isolated system, meticulously documenting every step. Explanation. This scenario presents a common and professionally challenging situation in cybersecurity incident response. The challenge lies in balancing the immediate need to contain and remediate a security breach with the critical requirement to preserve evidence for forensic analysis, regulatory compliance, and potential legal action. Rushing the covering tracks phase without proper procedure can irrevocably damage the integrity of the investigation, leading to inaccurate conclusions, missed root causes, and failure to meet legal and ethical obligations. The correct approach represents best professional practice because it prioritizes a forensically sound investigation. This involves meticulous documentation of all actions taken, including the identification and preservation of logs and other digital artifacts before any manipulation or deletion occurs. This adherence to forensic principles ensures that the evidence collected is admissible and reliable, enabling a thorough understanding of the intrusion's scope, methods, and impact. Furthermore, it aligns with the ethical duty of an ethical hacker to act with integrity and transparency, and with regulatory frameworks that mandate proper incident response and data breach notification procedures, which rely on accurate evidence. Each incorrect approach carries significant regulatory and ethical failures. Manipulating or deleting logs without proper forensic imaging and documentation directly violates the principle of evidence preservation. This action can be construed as obstruction of justice or a deliberate attempt to conceal the breach, leading to severe legal penalties and reputational damage. Ethically, it undermines the trust placed in the ethical hacker and the organization. Failing to detect or properly remove rootkits leaves the system vulnerable to persistent threats and further compromise, demonstrating a lack of due diligence and technical competence. This can result in regulatory noncompliance if the breach is not fully contained or if sensitive data remains at risk. The professional decision-making process for similar situations should involve a structured incident response plan that includes distinct phases for preparation, identification, containment, eradication, recovery, and lessons learned. Crucially, the plan must emphasize evidence preservation and forensic integrity from the outset. When faced with a potential intrusion, the ethical hacker must first assess the situation, prioritize containment while simultaneously initiating evidence collection and preservation protocols. All actions must be meticulously documented, including timestamps, actions performed, and the rationale behind them. Collaboration with legal counsel and relevant stakeholders is essential to ensure compliance with all applicable regulations and to guide the investigation appropriately. Question 15. System analysis indicates that during a penetration test of a web application, an ethical hacker discovers a critical SQL injection vulnerability that could allow an attacker to extract sensitive customer data. The hacker also identifies a directory traversal vulnerability that, while not immediately exposing sensitive information, allows access to configuration files. Considering the regulatory framework for ethical hacking in the United States, which of the following actions best aligns with professional and legal obligations? Option A. Publicly disclose the SQL injection vulnerability on a security forum to raise awareness and pressure the organization to fix it quickly. Option B. Attempt to exploit the buffer overflow vulnerability to gain administrative access to demonstrate the severity of the issue. Without prior written authorization, Option C. Ignore the directory traversal vulnerability as it only provides access to configuration files and not directly sensitive customer data. Option D. Immediately report the SQL injection and directory traversal vulnerabilities to the organization's designated security contact, providing detailed technical information and recommendations for remediation, while strictly adhering to the agreed-upon communication channels and scope of the engagement. Correct answer is D. Immediately report the SQL injection and directory traversal vulnerabilities to the organization's designated security contact, providing detailed technical information and recommendations for remediation, while strictly adhering to the agreed-upon communication channels and scope of the engagement. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge due to the inherent conflict between identifying and reporting vulnerabilities, which is a core ethical hacking responsibility, and the potential for such disclosures to inadvertently expose sensitive data or systems to further compromise if not handled with extreme care and adherence to established protocols. The need for deep analysis arises from the requirement to balance proactive security assessment with responsible disclosure and regulatory compliance. The correct approach represents best professional practice because it prioritizes a structured, controlled, and compliant method for vulnerability management. This involves thorough documentation, risk assessment, and communication through authorized channels, aligning with the principles of responsible disclosure and the legal frameworks governing data protection and cybersecurity. Specifically, in the context of U.S. regulations relevant to ethical hacking certifications like CEH, this approach aligns with the spirit of laws such as the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act, CFA, by ensuring that actions are authorized and that findings are reported in a manner that facilitates remediation rather than exploitation. It also implicitly supports compliance with data privacy regulations like HIPAA or GDPR, if applicable to the target environment, by ensuring that discovered vulnerabilities, which could lead to data breaches, are managed according to established security incident response plans. An incorrect approach that involves immediate public disclosure of a discovered SQL injection vulnerability without authorization or a remediation plan represents a significant regulatory and ethical failure. This action could be construed as unauthorized access or disclosure under the CFA, leading to legal repercussions. Ethically, it violates the principle of responsible disclosure, potentially causing harm to the organization and its users by alerting malicious actors to an exploitable weakness before it can be fixed. Another incorrect approach, such as attempting to exploit a buffer overflow vulnerability to gain elevated privileges for testing purposes without explicit, written authorization, is a direct violation of ethical hacking principles and likely illegal under the CFA. This crosses the line from authorized assessment to unauthorized access and potential damage. It bypasses established security controls and could lead to system instability or data corruption, creating liability for the ethical hacker. A third incorrect approach, which is to ignore a discovered directory traversal vulnerability because it only allows access to non-sensitive files, is also professionally unacceptable. While the immediate impact might seem low, it demonstrates a lack of thoroughness and a failure to identify potential pivot points for further attacks. Ethically, it is a dereliction of duty to report all identified weaknesses. From a regulatory perspective, even access to seemingly non-sensitive files could, in certain contexts, violate data access controls or privacy policies, especially if those files contain metadata or configuration information that could be leveraged by an attacker. The professional decision-making process for similar situations should involve a clear understanding of the scope of engagement, obtaining explicit written authorization for all testing activities, and adhering to a strict protocol for reporting vulnerabilities. This protocol should include detailed documentation, risk assessment, and communication through designated points of contact within the client organization. Professionals must always prioritize the principle of do no harm and ensure their actions are both legally compliant and ethically sound, focusing on enabling remediation rather than causing further risk. Question 16. During the evaluation of a competitor's security posture, An ethical hacker is tasked with gathering intelligence on their publicly accessible web applications and employee contact information. The objective is to understand potential attack vectors and identify areas for competitive advantage without directly interacting with the competitor's internal systems or networks. Which of the following reconnaissance techniques would be considered the most ethically sound and legally compliant approach within the U.S. regulatory framework for this objective? Option A. Employing social engineering tactics such as pretexting to impersonate a vendor and calling the competitor's IT department to inquire about their security software and patching policies. Option B. Utilizing advanced Google hacking, dorking, techniques to discover publicly indexed sensitive documents and misconfigured cloud storage buckets, and analyzing publicly available LinkedIn profiles for employee roles and contact details. Option C. Executing network vulnerability scans against the competitor's IP address ranges and attempting to gain unauthorized access to their internal email server to harvest employee email addresses. Option D. Sending unsolicited emails with malicious attachments to a broad list of suspected employee email addresses obtained through automated scraping to gauge their security awareness. The correct answer is B. Utilizing advanced Google hacking, dorking, techniques to discover publicly indexed sensitive documents and misconfigured cloud storage buckets, and analyzing publicly available LinkedIn profiles for employee roles and contact details. Explanation: this scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires an ethical hacker to gather information about a target organization without crossing legal or ethical boundaries, particularly when dealing with sensitive competitive intelligence. The core of the challenge lies in distinguishing between permissible passive reconnaissance and potentially intrusive active reconnaissance, especially when the goal is to understand a competitor's security posture. Careful judgment is required to ensure all actions align with the certified ethical hacker, say, code of ethics, and relevant U.S. cybersecurity regulations, such as those pertaining to unauthorized access and data privacy. The correct approach represents best professional practice because it prioritizes passive reconnaissance techniques. This involves utilizing publicly available information and open-source intelligence, OSINT, to glean insights into the target's infrastructure, employees, and potential vulnerabilities. Techniques like Google hacking dorking, to find publicly exposed documents or misconfigured services, and analyzing publicly available social media profiles for employee information, fall within this scope. These methods are generally legal and ethical as they do not involve direct interaction with the target's systems or networks, thus avoiding unauthorized access. This aligns with the CEH's emphasis on ethical conduct and respecting the boundaries of authorized penetration testing. An incorrect approach involving direct probing of the target's network without explicit authorization would constitute a regulatory and ethical failure. This could include attempting to scan ports, exploit known vulnerabilities, or engage in social engineering tactics like pretexting to elicit sensitive information directly from employees under false pretenses. Such actions would violate U.S. laws like the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act, CFA, which prohibits unauthorized access to computer systems. Ethically, it breaches the CEH's commitment to not causing harm or engaging in malicious activities. Similarly, attempting to harvest email addresses through automated tools that scrape websites or engage in phishing-like activities without consent would be a violation of privacy and potentially anti-spam laws, leading to legal repercussions and reputational damage. The professional decision-making process for similar situations should involve a clear understanding of the scope of engagement and the legal/ethical boundaries. Before commencing any reconnaissance, a thorough review of the authorization provided is paramount. If the scope permits only passive reconnaissance, then all efforts must be confined to publicly available information. If active reconnaissance is authorized, it must be conducted with extreme caution, using techniques that are explicitly permitted and documented, and always with the goal of identifying vulnerabilities for remediation, not exploitation. A risk assessment should be performed at each stage to evaluate the potential for legal or ethical breaches, ensuring that the pursuit of information does not inadvertently lead to unauthorized access or data compromise. Question 17. The performance metrics show a significant increase in the number of newly discovered common vulnerabilities and exposures, CVE, affecting the organization's critical infrastructure over the past quarter. Given limited remediation resources, which approach best aligns with professional ethical obligations and best practices for vulnerability management. Option A. Systematically cross-reference newly discovered CVEs with National Vulnerability Database, NVD, severity ratings and exploitability information, and prioritize remediation efforts based on the combined risk assessment, also considering relevant OWASP Top 10 vulnerabilities for web-facing applications. Option B. Address only those CVEs that have been explicitly flagged as critical by internal security alerts, deferring action on others until they reach a similar status. Option C. Focus remediation efforts exclusively on the vulnerabilities listed in the OWASP Top 10, as these represent the most common and impactful threats to web applications. Option D. Prioritize remediation based solely on the sheer volume of CVEs identified, addressing the largest number of unique CVEs first regardless of their severity or exploitability. The correct answer is A. Systematically cross-reference newly discovered CVEs with National Vulnerability Database, NVD, severity ratings and exploitability information, and prioritize remediation efforts based on the combined risk assessment, also considering relevant OWASP Top 10 vulnerabilities for web-facing applications. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a common challenge in cybersecurity, prioritizing vulnerability remediation based on limited resources and a constant influx of new threat intelligence. The difficulty lies in balancing the immediate need to address known, high-impact vulnerabilities with the strategic imperative of maintaining a comprehensive understanding of the evolving threat landscape. A purely reactive approach can lead to missed critical threats, while an overly broad approach can be inefficient. The ethical and professional obligation is to implement a robust and defensible vulnerability management program that aligns with organizational risk tolerance and regulatory expectations. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach involves a systematic process that leverages established vulnerability databases and frameworks to inform risk-based prioritization. This aligns with best practices for vulnerability management, which emphasize understanding the context of a vulnerability within an organization's specific environment. By cross-referencing CVEs with NVD data for severity scoring and considering OWASP Top 10 for web application risks, an organization can create a prioritized list of vulnerabilities that pose the greatest actual risk. This approach is ethically sound, as it demonstrates due diligence in protecting assets and complying with potential regulatory requirements for risk management and incident prevention. It is also professionally responsible, ensuring that limited resources are allocated effectively to mitigate the most significant threats. Incorrect approaches analysis. Focusing solely on the number of CVEs without considering severity or exploitability is an ethically and professionally deficient approach. This can lead to misallocation of resources, addressing low-risk issues while critical vulnerabilities remain unpatched. It fails to demonstrate a risk-based approach, which is often an implicit or explicit expectation in cybersecurity frameworks and potentially in regulatory guidance concerning data protection and system integrity. Prioritizing only vulnerabilities listed in the OWASP Top 10, while important for web applications, is an incomplete strategy. This ignores vulnerabilities that may exist in other types of systems or applications not covered by the OWASP Top 10, potentially leaving significant gaps in security. This narrow focus can lead to regulatory noncompliance if the scope of security controls is mandated to be broader. Ignoring new CVEs until they are explicitly flagged by the NVD or OWASP is a dangerous and professionally irresponsible practice. This creates a significant delay in addressing emerging threats, leaving systems vulnerable to zero-day or rapidly exploited vulnerabilities. This reactive stance can be seen as a failure to maintain a proactive security posture, which is a fundamental ethical and professional responsibility. Professional reasoning. Professionals should adopt a risk-based decision-making framework. This involves 1. Asset identification and classification, understanding what needs to be protected and its criticality. 2. Vulnerability identification, regularly scanning and monitoring for known vulnerabilities using sources like CVE and NVD. 3. Threat intelligence integration, correlating identified vulnerabilities with active threats and exploitability information. 4. Risk assessment, evaluating the likelihood of exploitation and the potential impact on critical assets. 5. Prioritization, ranking vulnerabilities based on their assessed risk. 6. Remediation planning and execution, developing and implementing a plan to address prioritized vulnerabilities. 7. Verification and monitoring, confirming that remediation efforts are effective and continuously monitoring for new threats. This systematic approach ensures that security efforts are aligned with organizational objectives and risk appetite, demonstrating a commitment to effective and responsible cybersecurity practices. Question 18. The monitoring system demonstrates a significant number of vulnerabilities identified across various servers and workstations following a recent network scan. Among these are several medium-severity vulnerabilities on non-production web servers and a critical severity vulnerability on a database server hosting sensitive customer data. The IT security team has limited resources for immediate patching. Which of the following actions represents the most professional and effective approach to vulnerability management in this scenario? Option A. Immediately deploy patches for all identified medium and critical vulnerabilities, prioritizing the non-production web servers to clear the backlog. Option B. Focus immediate remediation efforts on the critical severity vulnerability on the database server, while scheduling a risk assessment for the medium severity vulnerabilities on non-production servers to determine their impact and potential for exploitation. Option C. Ignore the medium severity vulnerabilities on non-production servers, as they do not directly impact customer data, and focus solely on the critical vulnerability on the database server. Option D. Escalate all identified vulnerabilities to the development team for immediate code review and patching, regardless of severity or asset type. Correct answer is A. Immediately deploy patches for all identified medium and critical vulnerabilities, prioritizing the non-production web servers to clear the backlog. Explanation. This scenario presents a common challenge in cybersecurity, prioritizing remediation efforts based on vulnerability scan results. Professional challenge lies in interpreting the output of vulnerability analysis tools and translating that data into actionable security improvements within the constraints of available resources and potential business impact. Careful judgment is required to avoid both overreacting to minor issues and underreacting to critical threats. The correct approach involves a systematic process of correlating vulnerability scan data with asset criticality and threat intelligence. This aligns with best professional practices by focusing on the most impactful risks to the organization. From a regulatory and ethical standpoint, this approach demonstrates due diligence in protecting sensitive data and maintaining system integrity, which are often mandated by frameworks like NIST, National Institute of Standards and Technology, guidelines, commonly referenced in U.S.-based cybersecurity certifications like CEH. Specifically, NIST SB 800-53, which outlines security controls, emphasizes risk management and prioritizing security efforts based on impact. By focusing on vulnerabilities affecting critical assets and those actively exploited, the organization is acting responsibly to mitigate potential breaches and comply with data protection regulations. An incorrect approach of immediately patching every identified vulnerability, regardless of severity or asset importance, is inefficient and can lead to operational disruptions. This lacks professional judgment by failing to conduct a risk assessment, potentially wasting valuable IT resources on low-impact issues. Ethically, it could be seen as a failure to manage resources effectively, indirectly impacting the organization's ability to address more significant threats. Another incorrect approach of ignoring vulnerabilities on less critical assets, even if they are severe, is also professionally unacceptable. While resource allocation is important, a severe vulnerability on any system, even if deemed less critical, could serve as an entry point for lateral movement by an attacker to reach more sensitive systems. This demonstrates a failure to understand the interconnectedness of an IT environment and a potential disregard for comprehensive security. It could lead to regulatory noncompliance if data residing on those less critical assets is subject to protection mandates. A further incorrect approach of relying solely on the default severity ratings provided by the vulnerability scanner without further context is also problematic. These ratings are often based on general CVSS, Common Vulnerability Scoring System, scores, but do not account for the specific environment, existing compensating controls, or the actual exploitability of the vulnerability within that context. This can lead to misallocation of resources and a false sense of security or undue alarm. Professionally, it signifies a lack of critical thinking and a failure to perform a thorough risk assessment tailored to the organization. The professional decision-making process should involve 1. Understanding the organization's critical assets and their business functions. 2. Reviewing vulnerability scan reports and correlating findings with asset criticality. 3. Incorporating threat intelligence to understand which vulnerabilities are actively being exploited. 4. Assessing the potential impact of a successful exploit for each vulnerability. 5. Prioritizing remediation based on a combination of severity, exploitability, and asset criticality. 6. Documenting the decision-making process and the rationale for prioritization. Question 19. Regulatory review indicates that an ethical hacker is tasked with assessing the security posture of a client's network. The client has provided a general authorization to assess network vulnerabilities. The ethical hacker is considering several initial network reconnaissance techniques. Which of the following approaches best aligns with regulatory compliance and ethical best practices for this scenario, assuming the jurisdiction is the United States? Option A. Perform a ping sweep across all public IP address ranges within the client's geographical region to identify all potential network assets. Option B. Initiate a UDP scan on a wide range of ports for all identified active hosts to detect potential UDP-based vulnerabilities. Option C. Conduct a TCP Connect scan across all common ports on the client's provided IP address range to identify open services and gather banner information. Option D. Obtain explicit, written authorization detailing the specific IP ranges, ports, and scanning methodologies to be employed before commencing any network scanning. The correct answer is C. Conduct a TCP Connect scan across all common ports on the client's provided IP address range to identify open services and gather banner information. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge due to the inherent tension between the need for network reconnaissance to identify vulnerabilities and the legal and ethical boundaries governing such activities. The certified ethical hacker, say, must operate within a defined scope of authorization and adhere strictly to the regulatory framework of the target jurisdiction. Misinterpreting or exceeding these boundaries can lead to severe legal repercussions and ethical breaches. The correct approach represents best professional practice because it prioritizes obtaining explicit, written authorization before conducting any network scanning activities. This aligns with the fundamental ethical principle of consent and the legal requirement to avoid unauthorized access or interference with computer systems. In the U.S., for example, the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act, CFA, prohibits unauthorized access to protected computers. Obtaining authorization ensures that the scanning activities are conducted within legal parameters and do not constitute a criminal offense. Furthermore, clearly defining the scope of the engagement prevents accidental scanning of unauthorized systems, which could lead to legal liabilities for the ethical hacker and their organization. An incorrect approach involving performing a SYN scan without explicit authorization is a regulatory and ethical failure. While a SYN scan is a stealthier technique than a TCP Connect scan, it still involves probing network ports and can be detected. Conducting such scans without permission is a violation of unauthorized access laws, such as the CFA in the U.S., and breaches the ethical obligation to respect system boundaries. Another incorrect approach, performing a UDP scan on a broad range of ports without specific justification or authorization, is also a significant regulatory and ethical failure. UDP scans can be resource-intensive and may generate considerable network traffic, potentially impacting system performance. Without proper authorization and a clear understanding of the target's network, this action could be construed as a denial-of-service attempt or unauthorized network probing, leading to legal consequences and a breach of professional ethics. A third incorrect approach, conducting a ping sweep across an entire public IP address range without prior authorization, is a clear violation. Ping sweeps are used to identify active hosts on a network. Performing this on a large, unapproved range is akin to unauthorized surveillance and can trigger intrusion detection systems, leading to accusations of malicious activity. This directly contravenes the principle of authorized access and could result in legal penalties under laws governing unauthorized network activity. The professional decision-making process for similar situations should involve a rigorous adherence to the authorization process. This includes 1. Understanding the scope of engagement and obtaining explicit, written permission for all intended activities. 2. Identifying the specific regulatory framework applicable to the target environment. 3. Selecting scanning techniques that are appropriate for the authorized scope and minimize potential disruption. 4. Documenting all activities, including authorization, methodologies, and findings. 5. Reporting findings transparently and ethically. Question 20. The risk matrix shows a moderate likelihood of service misconfiguration on external-facing web servers. During an authorized penetration test, the ethical hacker needs to identify running services, their versions, and any exposed banners to assess potential vulnerabilities. Which of the following approaches best balances the need for information gathering with the requirement to avoid unauthorized access or disruption? Option A. Conduct aggressive port scanning across all common service ports, followed by forceful banner grabbing attempts on any open ports, and immediately attempt to exploit any identified vulnerabilities to confirm their impact. Option B. Utilize passive reconnaissance techniques to gather publicly available information about the target, such as DNS records and HTTP headers, and employ non-intrusive methods like Nmap service detection with default scripts to identify running services and versions without overwhelming the target. Option C. Immediately attempt to brute force credentials on all identified services, regardless of their type or the information gathered about them, to quickly ascertain access levels. Option D. Focus solely on identifying the IP addresses of the web servers and then proceed to launch a distributed denial of service (DDoS) attack to test their resilience. The correct answer is A. Conduct aggressive port scanning across all common service ports, followed by forceful banner grabbing attempts on any open ports, and immediately attempt to exploit any identified vulnerabilities to confirm their impact. Explanation. This scenario presents a common challenge in ethical hacking, balancing the need for comprehensive service enumeration with the imperative to avoid unauthorized access or disruption, all while adhering to strict legal and ethical boundaries. The professional challenge lies in accurately identifying running services, their versions, and potential vulnerabilities without crossing the line into malicious activity. This requires a nuanced understanding of what constitutes permissible reconnaissance versus intrusive probing. The correct approach represents best professional practice because it prioritizes non-intrusive, passive techniques for initial service enumeration and banner grabbing. This aligns with the ethical hacking principle of do no harm and adheres to the spirit of authorized penetration testing, which typically begins with information gathering that does not alter the target system's state. Specifically, using tools that analyze network traffic or publicly available information, like DNS records or WHOIS data, to infer running services and versions is a low-risk, high-reward strategy. This method respects the confidentiality and integrity of the target systems, minimizing the chance of triggering security alerts or causing service interruptions, which could have legal ramifications if not explicitly authorized. It also lays a solid foundation for more targeted, active enumeration later in the engagement, if deemed necessary and within the scope of authorization. An incorrect approach that involves aggressive banner grabbing with tools that send malformed packets or repeatedly attempt to connect to every possible port without prior analysis is professionally unacceptable. This could be interpreted as a denial of service, DoS attempt, or unauthorized scanning, potentially violating laws like the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act, CFA, in the U.S., which prohibits unauthorized access to computer systems. Such actions can trigger intrusion detection systems, IDs, and intrusion prevention systems, IPS, leading to the termination of the engagement and potential legal repercussions for the ethical hacker. Furthermore, attempting to exploit identified service vulnerabilities without explicit authorization, even if the intent is to demonstrate risk, is a clear ethical and legal violation. This moves beyond reconnaissance into active exploitation, which is strictly prohibited unless specifically permitted within a defined scope of work and under controlled conditions. The professional decision-making process for similar situations should involve a thorough understanding of the authorized scope of the engagement. Before any enumeration begins, ethical hackers must clarify what types of scanning and probing are permitted. They should always start with passive reconnaissance techniques, gathering as much information as possible without directly interacting with the target systems. If active enumeration is required, it should be performed incrementally, starting with less intrusive methods and escalating only as necessary and authorized. Continuous monitoring of the target environment for any signs of detection or disruption is crucial. If any activity appears to be causing adverse effects, the ethical hacker must immediately cease that activity and consult with the client. Documentation of all actions taken, including the rationale behind them, is paramount for accountability and reporting.